Most people think they know how the Second World War ended. They think of the flags over the Reichstag, the celebrations in Times Square, and the signing of treaties. But the actual end, the final pulse-pounding heart of the collapse, didn't happen in the light of day. It happened 30 feet underground, in a damp concrete tomb that smelled of exhaust and desperation. To understand the end, we must look at the math of the beginning. By mid-April 1945, the German Eastern Front was no longer a line. It was a series of fortified places being bypassed by a Soviet steamroller. The Stavka, the Soviet High Command, had a singular obsession: Berlin. Stalin knew that whoever captured the city captured the symbols of power and, more importantly, the German nuclear research archives. On April 16th, the barrage began. It was the largest artillery concentration in history. Along the Oder River, 14,300 guns opened fire simultaneously. The sound was heard as far away as the suburbs of Berlin, 40 miles to the west. We look at the Soviet First Belarusian Front under Zhukov and the First Ukrainian Front under Konev. This wasn't just a military operation, it was a race. Stalin had intentionally played his two marshals against each other, dangling Berlin as the prize. This rivalry would lead to reckless frontal assaults and staggering loss of life, but it ensured the ring closed with terrifying speed. Let's look at the terrain. The Silo Heights rose 150 feet above the Oder marshlands. It was a natural fortress. Defending it was General Theodore Bessie's Ninth Army. These weren't the elite divisions of 1941. These were the stomach battalions, men with chronic illnesses, mixed with the Hitler Youth and the Volkssturm. Zhukov made a catastrophic tactical error here. He launched his attack at 4 a.m. using 143 anti-aircraft searchlights to blind the Germans. Instead, the lights reflected off the thick smoke and dust silhouetting his own tanks. The T-34s became sitting ducks for the German 8.8-seamer flak guns. For 72 hours, the heights were a slaughterhouse. We have accounts from German soldiers who described the endless red carpet of Soviet infantry. By the time the heights fell on April 19th, the Soviets had lost over 30,000 men. But Buss's Ninth Army was shattered. The ring of fire had moved from the river to the doorstep of the capital. As the front line collapsed, Berlin was declared a Festung, or fortress. But it was a fortress in name only. We need to examine the vanguard of the apocalypse, the refugees. Hundreds of thousands of civilians were flooding into the city from the east, bringing stories of the Red Army's vengeance. Inside the city, the defense was under the command of General Helmuth Weidling. His army group Vistula was a ghost. He found himself commanding boys as young as 12 who were being handed Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons and told to stop IS-2 Joseph Stalin tanks. We look at the Flying Courts Martial. SS squads were roaming the streets, hanging any man, soldier or civilian, found in a basement or without a weapon. Their bodies were left dangling from lampposts with signs saying, "I betrayed the Führer." This was the internal Ring of Fire, a reign of terror against their own people as the external enemy closed in. By April 24th, the pincers met. The last railway line out of Berlin was cut. The last major airfield at Gatow was under fire. Berlin was now a pressure cooker. There were roughly 2.7 million people trapped inside. Food supplies were calculated to last 30 days, but the distribution centers were already being captured. As the Soviet artillery began its systematic block-by-block leveling of the city, the residents retreated to the U-Bahn tunnels and the massive flak towers. The Ring of Fire was now tight enough that Soviet shells were landing on the Chancellery Garden. The man responsible for this carnage was now trapped in his own tomb. The siege was over. The battle for the streets had begun. To understand the final days, one must understand the geography of the Führer bunker. It was not one bunker, but two. The Vorbunker, or upper bunker, was located under the large dining hall of the old Chancellery. Here, the kitchen staff, the doctors, and the Goebbels family lived in cramped 10 by 10 rooms. Beneath that, another 15 feet down, was the Führer bunker proper. It was protected by a concrete roof nearly 13 feet thick. It was damp. Water constantly seeped through the walls, and the diesel generator for the lights and ventilation provided a perpetual bone-shaking hum. The air was a toxic mix of stale sweat, exhaust fumes, and the smell of dogs. Hitler's private suite was humble. A small study, a bedroom, and a bathroom. There was no war room like the ones in movies. High-stakes military decisions were made in a narrow corridor barely 4 feet wide, where generals had to flatten themselves against the wall just to let a waiter pass with a tray of tea. By late April, the man who had terrified Europe was physically disintegrating. Eyewitness accounts from his secretaries, Traudl Junge and Gerda Christian, describe a man who looked 70 years old at age 56. His left arm shook so violently that he had to pin it against his body or sit on it. We look at the role of Dr. Theodor Morell. Morell had been Hitler's personal physician for years, treating him with a cocktail of Vitamultin and Pervitin, essentially high-grade methamphetamines, along with injections of testosterone and even extracts from bull testicles. In these final days, Morell was dismissed. Hitler accused him of trying to drug him into a stupor to smuggle him out of Berlin. Without his miracle injections, Hitler began to suffer from massive withdrawal symptoms on top of Parkinson's disease. His mood swung from catatonic silence to screaming rages that lasted for hours, echoing through the concrete halls. The atmosphere in the bunker was a bizarre cocktail of a funeral and a cocktail party. Because the ventilation was failing, many of the officers and staff began smoking, something strictly forbidden by Hitler for years. In the canteen area, the drinking was heavy. Officers like General Hans Krebs and General Wilhelm Bergdorf spent their nights drinking cognac and champagne. There was a sense of last days hedonism. We have accounts of impromptu dances being held in the chancellery cellars, while Soviet shells were literally collapsing the rooms above them. The primary topic of conversation wasn't military strategy. It was the most effective way to commit suicide. People discussed the merits of a gunshot to the temple versus biting a cyanide capsule. The SS doctors, Dr. Ernst Robert Grawitz and Dr. Ludwig Stumpfeger, were constantly asked for the pills. Grawitz eventually took his own advice, blowing himself and his family up with 2 grenades at the dinner table. Communication with the outside world was now down to a single teletype machine and a radio operator. Hitler spent his hours waiting for news of Wenck's 12th Army. He believed General Walther Wenck was coming from the west to drive the Russians back. What Hitler didn't know or refused to hear was that Wenck's army was largely a collection of teenagers and training units that were themselves being decimated. On April 28th, a news report from the BBC reached the bunker that changed everything. Heinrich Himmler, the loyal head of the SS, had attempted to negotiate a separate peace with the Western Allies. Narrator: this was the final blow. To Hitler, Himmler's betrayal was the ultimate stab in the back. The ring of fire was no longer just outside the walls, the fire was now inside the regime. Hitler realized the end could no longer be delayed. It was time to write his will. To understand Hitler's state of mind on April 28th, we must look at the map of delusion. Hitler was no longer commanding real divisions, he was commanding names on a piece of paper. The most famous of these was Steiner's detachment. Narrator: SS General Felix Steiner was ordered to launch an impossible pincer movement to break the Soviet encirclement. When Steiner, who had only a few thousand exhausted men and no tanks, refused to move, the bunker witnessed a total psychological breakdown. During the afternoon conference, Hitler ordered everyone out except the top generals, Keitel, Jodl, Krebs, and Bergdorf. For the next 3 hours, his screams could be heard through the soundproof doors. He declared that the SS had deserted him, that his generals were the scum of the German people. And finally, for the first time, he stated clearly, "The war is lost. I shall stay in Berlin and shoot myself." While Hitler faced military collapse, a deeper betrayal arrived via a Swedish news report. Heinrich Himmler, the Reichsführer SS, the man Hitler called Der Treue Heinrich, the loyal Heinrich, had been secretly meeting with Count Folke Bernadotte of the Swedish Red Cross. Himmler had offered the surrender of the Western Front to the Allies, falsely claiming that Hitler was incapacitated or already dead. When the report was confirmed, Hitler's rage was replaced by a cold, murderous clarity. He ordered the immediate arrest and execution of Hermann Fegelein, the SS liaison officer in the bunker and the husband of Eva Braun's sister. Despite Eva Braun's pleas, Fegelein was dragged into the Chancellery Garden and shot by an SS firing squad. This act signaled that the bunker law was now absolute, total loyalty or total death. In the early hours of April 29th, shortly after midnight, one of the strangest ceremonies in history took place. To reward Eva Braun for her loyalty unto death, Hitler agreed to marry her. A low-level municipal official, Walter Wagner, was plucked from a foxhole in the streets and brought into the bunker to perform the civil ceremony. We have the marriage certificate. Both parties swore they were of pure Aryan descent, while Soviet shells shook the ceiling. The wedding breakfast followed, a surreal affair with champagne and liverwurst sandwiches. For the next 36 hours, the staff was instructed to address Eva Braun as Frau Hitler. It was a title she would hold for less than 2 days. After the wedding, Hitler summoned his youngest secretary, Traudl Junge, to a separate room. "Write this down," he told her. This was his final political testament. Historians have analyzed these pages for decades. They contain no remorse, no apology for the millions of dead, and no admission of personal failure. Instead, Hitler used his final hours to blame international Jewry for the war. He expelled Göring and Himmler from the party, appointed Admiral Karl Dönitz as his successor, and gave a final chilling order to the German people to continue the struggle even after he was gone. Traudl Junge later recalled that her hands were shaking so violently she could barely hit the keys. Hitler was not writing a history, he was attempting to write a myth. April 30th began with a gray, smoke-filled dawn. At 6 a.m., Hitler summoned General Weidling, the Berlin defense commander. The report was terminal. The Soviets were in the Tiergarten, and the Reichstag was under direct assault. Weidling told Hitler that the ammunition would run out by nightfall. At 10 p.m., Hitler had his final meal, a simple lunch of pasta with light sauce. He was remarkably calm, the rages of the previous days replaced by a cold, detached efficiency. He then went into the corridor to say his final goodbyes to the staff. He shook hands with his secretaries, Traudl Junge and Gerda Christian, and his cook, Constanze Manziarli. He gave them his final gift, cyanide capsules. Before the Führer's end, a darker ritual was unfolding in the upper bunker. Magda Goebbels, the First Lady of the Third Reich, had decided her 6 children would not live in a world without National Socialism. Despite pleas from the secretaries to smuggle the children out, Magda remained firm. At approximately 8 p.m. later that evening, following Hitler's death, she would put them to bed. According to later testimony from the bunker dentist Helmut Kuntz, the children were injected with morphine. Once unconscious, Magda, possibly assisted by Hitler's doctor, Ludwig Stumpfegger, crushed cyanide capsules between their teeth. This act remains one of the most chilling examples of the fanatical cult mentality that defined the bunker's final hours. The eldest, 12-year-old Helga, reportedly had bruises on her face, suggesting she may have woken up and struggled, the only one to resist the mercy of the Reich. At 3:15 p.m., Adolf and Eva Hitler retired to their private study. Martin Bormann, Joseph Goebbels, and the valet Heinz Linge waited in the narrow hallway. For approximately 15 minutes, there was silence. Then a single shot rang out, muffled by the thick concrete walls. They waited. Linge later recalled the smell of burnt almonds, the scent of cyanide wafting from under the door. Upon entering, they found the couple on a small blue sofa. Eva Braun had no visible wounds. She had died from cyanide ingestion. Hitler had a bullet hole in his right temple. His 7.65mm Walther pistol lay at his feet. The bodies were immediately wrapped in gray blankets and carried up the emergency stairs. In the Chancellery Garden, under a literal rain of Soviet fire, they were placed in a shell crater, doused with 200 liters of gasoline and set ablaze. Because of the intense heat and the lack of oxygen in the crater, the bodies would not be fully cremated, a detail that would haunt historians for years. On May 2nd, the Red Army finally stormed the bunker. They found the charred remains of the Goebbels family and eventually 2 burnt bodies in the garden. Here, the story takes a turn into the world of espionage. Stalin was deeply paranoid. He ordered a total blackout on the discovery. He wanted Hitler's death to remain unconfirmed to the West, using the mystery as a political weapon against the Allies. The Soviets secretly performed an autopsy in a basement in the Berlin suburb of Buch. They had recovered Hitler's dental bridges from the charred remains. They tracked down the assistant to Hitler's dentist, Käthe Häusermann, and she identified the dental work from memory and sketches. The evidence was 100% conclusive, yet, for decades, the Soviet Union officially maintained that Hitler might have escaped to Argentina, fueling the conspiracy theories that persist to this day. The death of Adolf Hitler was not the glorious twilight of the gods he had envisioned. It was a squalid, claustrophobic exit in a hole in the ground. His legacy was a continent in ruins and a global map redrawn by the Cold War. In the end, the man who believed he was a master of destiny was reduced to a few charred bones and a dental bridge in a Soviet cigar box. Narrator: as we look back on these 60 minutes, we see that the Ring of Fire didn't just consume a city, it consumed a regime that had abandoned its humanity long before the first shell fell on Berlin. At 3:30 p.m. on April 30th, 1945, a single gunshot echoed through the Führer bunker in Berlin. But the Third Reich did not die with Adolf Hitler. Technically, legally, bureaucratically, it lived on for 23 more days. According to Hitler's final political testament, written just hours before his death, the new leader of Germany would not be Heinrich Himmler or Hermann Göring, both of whom he had expelled from the party in his last paranoid hours. Instead, he appointed Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, a military man with little political ambition, to become the new Reichspräsident. Dönitz established his headquarters in Flensburg, a sleepy naval town barely 100 kilometers from the Danish border. This so-called Flensburg government had de jure authority over a country that no longer existed. Berlin was in ruins. The Allies had carved Germany into occupation zones, and yet in Flensburg, Nazi officials still wore their uniforms, held cabinet meetings, and saluted portraits of the dead Führer. But Dönitz had only one real objective: delay the unconditional surrender long enough to evacuate millions of German soldiers and civilians from the east. He feared the Soviet occupation more than Allied justice, so he stalled, negotiated, and bought time, allowing over 2 million Wehrmacht troops and countless refugees to flee westward into American and British custody, rather than face Stalin's wrath. For nearly 3 weeks, Flensburg existed in a surreal state of denial. Nazi bureaucrats debated whether portraits of Hitler should remain on office walls. They discussed theoretical policies for a Germany that was already being dismantled. They drank wine and drafted memoranda, while the rest of the world prepared for the Nuremberg trials. On May 7, 1945, General Alfred Jodl signed the unconditional surrender documents at Eisenhower's headquarters in Reims, France. The war in Europe officially ended at 11:01 p.m. on May 8th, but Dönitz's government continued to function, holding meetings, issuing orders to military units that no longer existed. Finally, on May 23, 1945, the Allies had had enough. British forces launched Operation Blackout, a swift military operation involving the Cheshire Regiment, the Herefordshire Regiment, and tanks from the 15th 19th Hussars. At 10:00 a.m., British soldiers surrounded the Naval Academy and Glucksburg Castle. Two Royal Navy destroyers, HMS Zodiac and HMS Zealous, blocked Flensburg Fjord to prevent any escapes by sea. By 11:30 a.m., it was over. 5,000 German prisoners were taken into custody. Dönitz, General Jodl, and Admiral Hans-Georg von Friedeburg were formally arrested and charged with war crimes. The ghost government of the Third Reich had finally been exorcised. Hitler's Reich had lasted exactly 23 days longer than Hitler himself. Hitler's death did not bring relief to Germany. For millions of ordinary Germans, it triggered something far darker, a psychological collapse that swept across the country like a plague. For 12 years, Nazi propaganda had hammered a single message into the German psyche. The Führer and the Fatherland were one and the same. Hitler was not just a political leader. He was a messianic figure, a father, a savior. And now he was gone. For many, the Reich's defeat meant the end of civilization itself. But there was another fear, a primal, visceral terror that Nazi propaganda had cultivated for years, the fear of the Russians. The regime had painted the Soviet Red Army as a barbaric horde bent on revenge, rape, and extermination. As Soviet forces advanced westward, that fear became reality. In the final weeks of the war, tens of thousands of Germans, soldiers, party officials, and ordinary civilians chose death over surrender. Some used cyanide capsules, the same bitter pill that Hitler himself had bitten down on in the bunker. Others used guns, ropes, or threw themselves into rivers. But nowhere was this mass death epidemic more devastating than in the small Pomeranian town of Demmin. By late April 1945, Demmin's population had nearly doubled. Thousands of refugees from the east had flooded into the town, fleeing the advancing Red Army. The Wehrmacht had ordered women, children, and elderly men to dig a 5-kilometer-long anti-tank ditch east of the town. But it was futile. The Red Army was unstoppable. On April 28th, the retreat began. Nazi party officials fled in confiscated fire engines. The police abandoned their posts. The hospital was evacuated. And then, in a final act of cruelty, the retreating German forces blew up all 3 bridges over the Peene and Tollens rivers that encircled the town. The bridges were destroyed to slow the Soviet advance, but it also trapped the remaining civilians inside the town, turning Demmin into a cage. On April 30th and May the 1st, Soviet forces entered Demmin. What followed was chaos. Buildings were looted and burned. Executions were carried out in the streets. Mass rapes occurred. The town descended into hell. And then the deaths began. Between April 30th and May 4th, 1945, somewhere between 700 and over 1,000 people killed themselves in Demmin. Entire families walked into the rivers and drowned together, parents holding their children's hands as they waded into the cold water. Others hanged themselves in their homes. Some slit their wrists. Many used cyanide. The exact death toll remains uncertain. A list compiled by Marga Behnke, the daughter of the town's cemetery gardener, recorded over 400 confirmed deaths between May 6th and July 15th, 1945. But historians believe the true number was far higher. Bodies were buried in mass graves, hastily and without ceremony. Demmin was not an isolated case. Mass deaths occurred in dozens of German towns as the Red Army advanced, but Demmin remains the largest mass death event in German history. For decades after the war, the East German Communist government suppressed the story. The mass deaths were blamed on werewolf activities, or Germans disguised as Soviets. It was only after German reunification in 1990 that the truth began to emerge. The people of Demmin had not just been victims of war, they had been victims of the psychological apocalypse that Hitler's death had unleashed. Now we come to one of the strangest mysteries of the 20th century. What happened to Adolf Hitler's body? The official story is that Hitler's corpse was burned in the Reich Chancellery Garden on the afternoon of April 30th, 1945, and reduced to ash. But that's only half true. Soviet counterintelligence units, SMERSH, secretly recovered charred remains from the bomb crater where Hitler and Eva Braun had been burned. In May 1945, Soviet forensic teams conducted a covert autopsy. They examined dental bridges, bone fragments, and tissue samples. The findings were classified as top secret and sent directly to Joseph Stalin. But the Soviets never publicly confirmed that they had found Hitler's body. For decades, they maintained ambiguity, fueling conspiracy theories and speculation. What followed was a bizarre 25-year journey, a macabre game of hide-and-seek with history. The 5 burials of Adolf Hitler, first burial, June 1945, Buch, Germany. The remains were secretly buried in a forest near the town of Rathenau, just outside Berlin. But the Soviets feared discovery, so 8 months later, they dug them up again. Second burial, February 1946, Finow, Germany. The remains were moved to a new Soviet facility in the town of Finow, but this location was also deemed insecure. Third burial, February 21st, 1946, Magdeburg, East Germany. The remains were reburied on the grounds of a Soviet military garrison in Magdeburg. This time they were placed under a paved courtyard, hidden beneath the feet of Soviet soldiers who had no idea what they were walking over. For 24 years, Hitler's remains stayed buried in Magdeburg. The secret was known only to a handful of high-ranking KGB officials. But in 1970, everything changed. In March 1970, the Soviet government decided to hand over the Magdeburg garrison to East German civilian authorities. This created a problem. If the burial site became public knowledge, it could become a neo-Nazi shrine. On March 21, 1970, KGB Director Yuri Andropov authorized a final operation, the complete destruction of Adolf Hitler's remains. On April 4, 1970, a team of KGB agents conducted Operation Archive. They exhumed the remains one last time. 2 protocols were compiled, one documenting the opening of the grave and another detailing the physical destruction. The bones of Adolf Hitler, along with those of Eva Braun, Joseph Goebbels, Magda Goebbels, and their 6 children, were burned on a campfire outside Magdeburg. The ashes were then scattered into the Biederitz River, a tributary of the Elbe. And just like that, Adolf Hitler was gone, reduced to ash, scattered into a river, erased from the earth. But not quite. The Soviets had kept 2 pieces, a fragment of a skull with a bullet hole and Hitler's jawbone with dental bridges. These were stored in the FSB archives in Moscow as proof of Hitler's death. In 2009, a controversy erupted. American researchers from the University of Connecticut analyzed DNA from the skull fragment and concluded it was from a woman aged 20 to 40. This reignited conspiracy theories. Was Hitler really dead? The FSB immediately pushed back. Vasily Christoforov, head of the FSB archives, insisted that the jawbone was authentic and that the skull fragment had never been properly tested. He argued that without Hitler's DNA for comparison, definitive proof was impossible. To this day, The jawbone remains locked in the FSB archives, the only physical evidence that Adolf Hitler ever existed. With Hitler dead and the Third Reich dissolved, the Allies faced a monumental task. How do you erase a cult from the mind of a nation? The answer was denazification, a systematic campaign to remove Nazis from positions of power, abolish Nazi organizations, and confront the German people with the horrors their leaders had committed. Former Nazi party members and SS officers were removed from government, industry, the judiciary, and the media. From 1945 to 1950, over 400,000 Germans were detained in internment camps while their backgrounds were investigated. By early 1947, the Allies held 90,000 Nazis in detention, and another 1.9 million were forbidden from working in anything but manual labor. But the most powerful aspect of denazification was not legal, it was psychological. In April and May 1945, Allied forces forced German civilians to tour the concentration camps. On April 16, 1945, over 1,100 German civilians from the city of Weimar were transported to Buchenwald concentration camp. They were made to walk through the barracks, see the crematorium ovens, view the piles of emaciated bodies, and read the statistics. 32,505 murdered since July 1937. Many wept, some fainted. German nurses collapsed from shock. An American sergeant, fluent in German, explained the exhibits from a nearby jeep, while thousands of liberated prisoners watched in silence, some barely alive, clinging to the rooftops of barracks. The civilians were shown torture chambers, dissection rooms, and laboratories where grotesque medical experiments had been conducted on living human beings. They saw gallows designed to hang 5 people at once. They saw the mounds of ash from the crematorium furnaces. In some cases, German civilians were forced to exhume mass graves of Nazi victims. They dug up the bodies with their own hands, confronted with the physical evidence of genocide. This was the reality of the final solution, the systematic extermination of 6 million Jews and millions of others that Hitler had orchestrated from the safety of his bunker. With their men dead or imprisoned, it fell to the Trümmerfrauen, the rubble women, to rebuild Germany from the ashes. Using sledgehammers, picks, and in bare hands, these women cleared 400 million cubic meters of debris, the equivalent of 16 square kilometers of rubble. They tore down buildings too damaged to repair, cleaned bricks of mortar, and stacked them for reuse. Contrary to the propaganda images of smiling women joyfully carrying stones, the reality was harsh. In Berlin, about 60,000 women participated, less than 5% of the female population. In Soviet-occupied areas, participation was often coerced. Neither men nor women viewed this work as honorable. It was seen as punishment. But they did it anyway because there was no other choice. These were the women who rebuilt Berlin. They cleared a path to the modern world, one brick at a time. And what of the bunker itself, the concrete tomb where Hitler had died? For 40 years, the Führer bunker sat buried beneath the city, hidden under rubble and paved streets. It became part of the no man's land between East and West Berlin, a silent ghost trapped in the front line of the Cold War. The very spot where Hitler had taken his life was now ground zero of a new kind of war, the ideological battle between communism and capitalism. The void Hitler left behind was filled not with heroism or legacy, but with division, barbed wire, and suspicion. In the 1980s, East German authorities built apartment buildings and a parking lot over the site. Today, there is no memorial, no monument, just an information panel on a quiet street corner. Adolf Hitler had dreamed of immortality. He envisioned himself as a Wagnerian hero, a Caesar, a figure whose name would echo through eternity. Instead, his aftermath was a series of secret burials in unmarked graves. His body was burned twice, once by his own aides and once by his enemies. His ashes were scattered into a river. His bones were locked in a vault. His bunker became a parking lot. He didn't just die. He vanished into the ash of the very world he tried to conquer. On May 8, 1945, while church bells rang and guns fell silent across a defeated continent, a very different ritual was beginning in the quiet Berlin suburb of Buch. In the basement of a requisitioned hospital, a room had been transformed into a secret laboratory. Bare walls, harsh lights, stainless steel tables, and a handful of men in white coats who understood that what they were about to touch was not just charred flesh, but history itself. On the table lay two burned bodies labeled with brutal simplicity, male and female. Both had been dragged from a shallow shell crater outside the Führer bunker, where witnesses said the corpses of Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun had been burned with petrol. The air in that room was thick with cigarette smoke, chemical disinfectant, and something else, pressure. Above the pathologists, above the officers, above even their commanding generals, one name hung like a storm cloud: Stalin. He wanted proof that Hitler was dead, but he also wanted ambiguity, leverage, the ability to suggest that his greatest enemy might have slipped away. And so this was not a normal autopsy. It was an autopsy conducted under the weight of geopolitics. The man in charge, Lieutenant Colonel Faust Shkarovsky of the Soviet Medical Service, knew that every line he wrote could echo all the way to the Kremlin. He noted the condition of the male body with clinical detachment. The corpse was severely charred, the outer tissues almost completely burned away from the legs and torso. The feet were gone, burned off at the ankles, and the hands were badly damaged. But deeper inside, the anatomy told a different story. Organs that, though heat damaged, were still recognizable. And inside the blackened mouth, vital evidence, teeth, and jawbone remained sufficiently preserved for identification. The face as such was gone, the recognizable features obliterated, but the skeleton and jaws were intact enough for a forensic conclusion about who this man had been. The female body beside him, also burned but slightly less mutilated, would be examined in parallel, her remains compared against what little was known of Eva Braun's medical history. On the file, a bureaucratic label was stamped in red, Top Secret, Case Number 63. The doctors began to work, measuring bone lengths, opening the torso, recording organ condition, and cutting through scorched tissue, all under the knowledge that this document might never be seen by anyone outside the Soviet system. For more than 50 years, they would be right. Between scalpels, forceps, and specimen jars, the most important instruments on that table were not blades at all, but the charred remnants of a human smile. Teeth, the forensic black box. In fire, flesh disappears, organs crack and shrivel, but enamel and metal endure. Hitler's mouth, notorious among his staff for its poor health, was a goldmine of forensic uniqueness. Years of bridges, crowns, root canals, and corrective work had turned his jaw into a kind of dental fingerprint. When the Soviet team carefully separated the head from the torso and began dissecting the skull, they removed both upper and lower jaws from the charred remains. In the upper jaw, they documented a distinctive dental bridge spanning multiple missing teeth. It carried 9 teeth made of gold and porcelain, fused in a configuration not seen in any standard dental catalogs. There was also a strange detail, a so-called window crown on one side, an opening in a crown designed to preserve a root or accommodate a particular alignment issue. It was the kind of thing only a long-term, specialized patient would ever have. Yet the Soviets were not content with internal paperwork alone. They needed external confirmation, and they needed it secretly. In the ruins of conquered Berlin, Soviet intelligence quietly tracked down a woman who carried the key. Kata Heusermann, the assistant to Hitler's personal dentist, Dr. Hugo Blaschke. She was not a politician, not a general, just a dental technician who had spent years staring into the Führer's mouth. She was brought into custody, questioned, and asked to do something very simple and very unnerving: to draw Hitler's teeth from memory. Sitting with pencil and paper without being shown the remains, Heiserman sketched the pattern of bridges, missing teeth, crowns, and the peculiar structure she remembered assisting with late in the war. What emerged on the page matched in eerie detail the bridge the Soviet pathologists had in their hands. She described and then physically identified a unique upper bridge that she herself had helped fit in 1944, a complex piece of work involving porcelain facings and metal framework that corresponded exactly to the structure lodged in the charred corpse's jaw. Another technician confirmed the same arrangement down to details that no outsider could have invented. Decades later, when the Cold War thawed and the archives cracked open slightly, those same dental fragments, by then stored in Moscow, were finally shown to outside experts. In 2018, a team of French forensic scientists examined what had become known as the Moscow teeth. Under microscopes and modern equipment, they saw heavy tartar and were consistent with a middle-aged man with long-standing dental problems. They found no evidence of meat fibers trapped in the calculus, which aligned well with Hitler's long-documented preference for a vegetarian diet. Though that alone was not conclusive, more crucially, they saw no blue staining or chemical corrosion on the teeth or dental metal that would have suggested a cyanide solution had eaten into the enamel. The jaws, taken together with the historical dental records and witnesses like Heiserman, form the strongest physical proof that the man on Shklovsky's table had been Adolf Hitler. Yet inside the Soviet report, there was something unresolved, something that would fuel books, documentaries, and conspiracy theories for generations. The question of how exactly Hitler died: poison or pistol? The female corpse, believed to be Eva Braun, showed signs consistent with cyanide poisoning. In the oral cavity and surrounding tissues, the doctors noted the presence of glass fragments, likely from a bitten ampule, and the telltale olfactory note described as the smell of bitter almonds, a classic though not universal indicator of cyanide. Cyanide acts quickly, interfering with cellular oxygen use and leading to rapid collapse of vital functions. For Eva, who was known to have vowed to die with Hitler rather than be captured, cyanide fit the witness accounts. She sat with him, took the capsule, and died almost instantly. The male body, however, told a more violent story beneath the burn marks. When the scorched skull was examined, the pathologists recorded a loss of cranium on the right side, a missing section of skull bone consistent with a gunshot wound that had blown out part of the head. In other words, there was physical evidence that a bullet had passed through or exploded within the skull, blasting away bone and brain tissue. That observation aligned uncannily with the testimony of those in the bunker who later said Hitler had sat on the couch, placed a pistol to his right temple, and pulled the trigger. But when the Soviet report was written and circulated upward, its language leaned heavily on cyanide, not on the bullet. The emphasis on poison, the repeated references to cyanide, and the relative quiet about the gunshot would become one of the strangest ambiguities in the entire case. Why understate the gun? The most plausible explanation is political, not medical. From Stalin's point of view, allowing Hitler a soldier's death by pistol, evoking the image of a commander fighting to the last, had propaganda risks. A death by poison, by contrast, looked weak, cowardly, more consistent with the image of a dictator who betrayed his people and refused to face consequences. The narrative of a cowering Führer biting on a glass capsule in his bunker suited Soviet messaging far better than that of a man calmly firing a pistol. Modern forensic interpretation, freed from Stalin's political needs, points to a more nuanced and more chilling scenario: redundancy. Hitler, obsessively fearful of capture and determined to leave nothing to chance, likely prepared a fail-safe method. He is thought to have bitten down on a cyanide capsule while simultaneously pressing the pistol to his temple and firing. In such a case, the cyanide would have shattered into his mouth at the exact moment the bullet tore through his brain, flooding the tissues with poison even as the gunshot alone would have been fatal. The presence of both a massive cranial defect and circumstantial cyanide indicators fits this dual method hypothesis. It was not poison or pistol, it was poison and pistol, two overlapping guarantees that he would never be taken alive. Beyond teeth and skull fractures, the autopsy also captured something more intimate, a final inventory of the last objects Hitler carried on his person when he died. In the pockets of the burned man from the crater, the Soviet team cataloged a handful of items that were not just personal effects, but relics of a collapsing ideology. One of them was a gold Nazi party badge, the distinctive emblem awarded to early or especially loyal members of the movement. Hitler's own badge, worn on his lapel at ceremonies and public appearances, had been a symbol of his personal bond with the party and its inner circle. To find such a badge in the burned remains was another circumstantial link between the unrecognizable corpse and the man who had led Germany into catastrophe. Another item was more private, a small locket containing a portrait of his mother, Clara Hitler. The image of a young, soft-faced Austrian woman preserved behind glass and metal formed a jarring contrast with the ruins of Berlin above and the charred body on the table. It suggested that even at the very end, Hitler carried with him a token from his childhood, a reminder of the only person he had ever openly described with warmth and affection. It was as if the last fragments of his emotional life were reduced to a tiny portrait buried in his pocket while his Reich collapsed around him. Also retrieved was an Iron Cross First Class, awarded during the First World War. This decoration had been part of Hitler's personal mythology for decades, proof, at least in his narrative, of courage under fire. The same medal that had once given a failed artist from Austria a sense of purpose and legitimacy now lay blackened beside a destroyed corpse, completing the circle between the trenches of 1914 and the bunker of 1945. These items, taken together with the dental structures, formed a chain of identity. Medals tied to his known service record, a badge assigned to him personally, a locket in keeping with his known attachment to his mother, and a jaw configuration matched by multiple witnesses and records. When the pathologists finished their work, organs examined, diagrams sketched, measurements taken, personal effects logged, they closed case number 63 with a stark, technical conclusion. The body on the table was that of Adolf Hitler, as established by dental identification and supported by the circumstantial evidence found on the remains. On a forensic level, the mystery was solved. The Führer of the Third Reich was not in Argentina, not in a submarine, not in a secret base in Antarctica. He had died in his bunker in Berlin, his body burned and partially destroyed, his jawbone and a handful of objects bearing witness to his identity. But while the science had spoken, politics had the final word. The report disappeared into Soviet archives, suppressed and classified. Outside those walls, Stalin allowed rumors to circulate. Maybe Hitler had escaped, maybe the Western allies were hiding him, maybe he still lived somewhere in shadow. These whispers served the needs of the emerging Cold War far better than a clear, closed story. And so, for decades, the world was left with questions while the answer sat in a locked drawer in Moscow. Only in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, when fragments of the report and the remains resurfaced, did the forensic record finally reach wider audiences. By then, the ghost of Hitler had already roamed through popular culture for generations, fueling novels, fake sightings, speculative documentaries, and an entire subculture of escape theories. The Buch autopsy had ended the story in May 1945. Human imagination and Cold War politics had simply refused to accept that ending.